Probably a bit of an unpopular take, but I don't like Welt Novaflare that much, but let's go over what they changed first. His skill now deals 5 bounces instead of 3, so basically a multiplier increase. His ultimate now inflicts weightless, which reduces speed by 5% and defense by 40% for 2 turns, but it also only delays the action by 12% instead of 40. You only get the rest of the delay when attacking the enemy with the weightless state, and one attack further delays it by 4% up to 8 times. His talent also got a big multiplier buff. Instead of 60%, it's now 100% or 110 if E6. If not super familiar with Welt, this may not look like a lot, but it actually applies per hit. So since his skill now hits 5 times, right, Welt gets 500% additional damage on top of that. Moving on, the 12% vulnerability has been changed to a 10% damage boost for your ally whenever they attack enemies with the weightless state up to 8 times. So again, it's similar to that action delay stacking thing, and Welt now also gets a 1-turn ultimate at the start of the battle. They also moved his old E1 into his trace. This can only apply once per enemy by the way, but is still extra damage. Finally, the useless weakness broken trace is changed to an effective rate to attack conversion, because now all Nihility units need to have this to at least be somewhat meta relevant, and it can give Welt 80% attack. The rest of his changes are his add-ons, E1, E4 and E6. E1 now also has that additional ultimate multiplier, like the other bonus ability, but again, it can only apply once per target and only against enemies in the weightless state. E4 is now a massive 30% resistance reduction, and E6 gives Welt an extra 30% crit rate and 60% crit damage if attacking a slowed enemy, but it does not apply to additional damage. Now let's talk about what's good about the changes. Welt gets a ton of extra attack multipliers. Combined with the free 80% attack from the effective rate and damage boost, Welt's individual damage skyrockets. Previously, it was actually straight up garbage. Like in a Hypercarry team before, he would actually deal less damage than just Little Ika in a Remembrance team. Not even a Hypercarry Hyacinth team. Just Little Ika by itself. But now E0 is already a 277% increase over his old version, and at E6 can go up to around 500% or about 46,000 TPV better than the old E6. Even though this is a big buff, this still puts him quite far behind the top tier 3 target DPSs like Remembrance, Relation or Firefly, but it's still quite respectable. On the other hand, the 12% vulnerability to 40% defense reduction is a smaller buff, but really good for teams that already have existing sources of defense reduction or ignore. But one of my favorite changes in the kit is actually E4. 30% rest reduction is actually really strong because it's quite rare nowadays. With Acheron, this is about 44,000 TPV, and if you look at Sustainers teams, it further shoots up to 70,000. With Sustainers Ashville, E2 Welt pushes him up to about 100,000 and 119,000 TPV at E4. That does sound great and all, however, there are also a few things I really dislike in the kit that holds him back. First, the action delay in the ultimate. I was just talking about running Sustainers teams with Welt, right? But in actual gameplay, this isn't very consistent in endgame content. For example, nowadays enemies can have 190 to 198 speed, so 12% delay does nothing. Of course, Welt also has a 15% speed reduction, right? But since your speed is so high to begin with, each 4% delay afterwards is still barely anything for this kind of enemies, making Sustainers Welt very hard to play consistently. So about all those Sustainers numbers I showed before, yeah, it actually rarely ever happens in actual endgame content unless you're fine with retrying and retrying over and over again for better RNG. It only really works consistently if you're like new to the game or something like that and you're playing Memory of Chaos 9, 10, whatever. But honestly at that point, whatever you use will work anyway, since it's much easier. The other thing I really dislike is the damage boost. Again, you have to hit multiple times to be able to benefit from this fully. So if your team is slower, like Acheron for example, you stack the damage boost very slowly. And at this point in the game, version 4.2, damage boost is actually just one of the worst stats to give your team. Elision and break damage literally cannot use regular damage boost at all, and for normal crit units who can use this, they usually already give themselves a lot of damage boost. This means that not only is the damage boost slow to stack, it is also already diminishing. And of course, as a result of being an action delay speed reducing type of unit, it's not ideal for teams like DOT, Remembrance, Mayday, Jingliu or Blade, and also not ideal against certain enemies or stages that need to take an action first before you can actually deal damage, like Flame Weaver. You have to let them take a turn first, which usually involves hitting your team, otherwise you not only delay the actions, you also delay your own clear speed. Also, his E6 does not apply to his additional damage for some reason, and his additional damage is the reason why Welt is able to put out such big numbers. to begin with. It just doesn't really make sense. I don't understand why this is the design choice. I hope this is a bug because like what the fuck. Overall, the buffs are objectively good, right? It goes from completely garbage to actually usable, and it can be a decent substitute if you're missing some units. But looking at just the end result and not just the increase of the buff, I still think Welt isn't in a very good spot. Maybe if you're new to the game, he can be great for a while, but if you generally know what you're doing when you're pulling new characters, he can very quickly become obsolete again. It also feels like he kinda needs E4 to be more competitive, so if you don't even have his E4, then he's just kinda okay. I guess pretty good for a standard character. Anyways, if you do have a reason to be using him still, then this is where we get into his builds. Firstly, for Relic sets, Welt's playstyle is split into Hypercarry and as a support. For Hypercarry, you usually run Pioneer plus Pen Cosmic. If you're running Dunhing, you can also consider Wondrous Banan if you don't need the extra effective rate. However, for a very specific case, Sunday plus Tutorial, and at least his E2, you can actually run Wastelander because he outs frequently enough to get a decent uptime from the buff, and this can outperform Pioneer. But if you are not using Sunday plus Tutorial, or the enemy has a lot of action advance, it's always going to be Pioneer Diver for its consistency. When played as a support, it's almost always going to be Eagle, but this usually requires at least E2 for 3 turns in one cycle. And since most DPSs he is paired with use attack, I recommend Ushaka. Since his attack trace was converted to effective rate, even with a light cone without effective rate, you can still hit the 80% pretty easily with just Pen Cosmic. Hence for both playstyles, I rarely had to use effective rate body. Other than that, it's still pretty much the same. Attack boosts with Sparkle, otherwise almost always speed. Damage boost is usually still better than an attack op, and of course ERR with Tutorial as a support, otherwise attack rope as a hypercarry. Now for light cones, it's split into two again. Firstly, for Hypercarry, Tutorial is actually the best. This is because I'm using Sunday and it can give up to 2 extra ultimates in 2 cycles. I don't know why some people said you can't run Tutorial on Hypercarry. That's actually just nonsense. From there we have Akron S1, In the Name of the World, it's Showtime, Boundless Choreo, Tonight Sleep Well, and We'll Meet Again. Again, this team is calculated with Sunday, Sparkle, Dunham PT, so Welt already gets a ton of crit damage and damage boost, which is why attack percent light cones generally perform better here. Otherwise, light cones like Boundless Choreo can actually perform better. Next, as a support, this is calculated in an Akron scenario, and the best light cone is Lies, Dance on the Breeze, but this is assuming Cypher also has this light cone. Hence, there is a ton of defense reduction stacking here, and why it performs so well. Same goes for Pulse S5. If you don't have other sources of defense reduction, these 2 light cones will perform worse. Next, the new Battle Pass light cone followed by Tutorial and those many springs. In this case, this is just a worse version of the Battle Pass light cone since you cannot get the full vulnerability. In last place, we have the Silver Wolf signature. The vulnerability only applies to 1 enemy at a time for 1 turn, and the crit rate is less useful for supports, right? So it's a really bad light cone in AoE scenarios with another DPS. Just take note that for Acheron specifically, Tutorial can give 1 more ultimate in the same simulation, which means it will be by far the best light cone damage wise, but I wanted a more general feel in case you are using other units as well. Finally, for team building, like I said, Welt has pretty much no best in slot teams he can fit in perfectly. The best right now should be in Asheville teams, but at the end of the day, Asheville does prefer much higher frequency of attack so you can get his ultimate faster. Hence, in general, you just look for ideally teams that either already have stacking defense reduction, has little to no damage boost, is not affected negatively by delaying the enemy's actions, and the opportunity cost of using Welt as a replacement for other units is not too high. And when you're playing Welt as a hypercarry, he can use a lot of supports. I've been using Sparkle plus Sunday because the energy is really nice. Otherwise, you normally run him with a sustain with ideally Sparkle, since she is really strong right now. And then the rest doesn't really matter too much, but ideally energy regen or more defense reduction. That is all for my Welt Novaflare review and guide. Thanks for watching, and see you.